Now, most people know the story of this franchise. A multiplayer-only launch shooter for the Xbox One, whose sequel would eventually make its debut on PC, PS4, and Xbox One, whose third entry would never see the light of day, and would eventually morph into what we now know as Apex Legends. For a lot of people, Titanfall 2 never got a fair shake. The release of the game followed the October 28th release date of Battlefield 1, EA's other big FPS franchise, which preceded the release of Call of Duty Infinite Warfare. EA attempted to sandwich Activision's yearly release of their behemoth FPS franchise in an attempt to gain market share. Of course, we now know that this strategy didn't work. Call of Duty has only cemented itself as an industry staple FPS, and all these years later, Battlefield never really caught up as a true competitor, and Titanfall 3 is nowhere to be found. I think for most people what's most disheartening about Titanfall 2's release is that the game was really good. A campaign with incredible set pieces and designs that actually did evoke a lot of the awe and scale of earlier Call of Duty campaigns from the 360 and PS3 generation. And a multiplayer suite that refined what was great about the first game while still keeping the core essence of the sandbox. Large-scale battles with AI and player teammates alike fighting alongside you, intense Titan battles, interesting weapons and equipment, and truly great multiplayer map design. While EA had hoped the game would sell around 10 million copies, most analysts have it pegged at around 4 million copies sold since release back in 2016. Comments just last year from Respawn head Vince Zampella, speaking to Tay Kim of Baron, said the following regarding its potential sequel. Quote, "We're not working on anything currently. I hate to say yes, then people latch onto that, and then skewer you when it doesn't come. But I would love to see it happen is the real answer. There's no exact dedicated plans for that. It has to be the right thing. It's such a beloved franchise for the fans and also for us. If it's not the right moment in time, the right idea, then it just doesn't make sense. Apex is the Titanfall universe, right? There's how do you do something that doesn't confuse people that are Apex fans, but not necessarily Titanfall fans yet? It's a hard question to answer, but ultimately I would love to see something." Now, I believe at the time, Vince is not burying any leads. The studio had long since seen the success of Jedi Fallen Order and Apex Legends, and had nothing else incubated within the Titanfall universe. So, why do I bring up Titanfall 3 then? It's clear that Vince is telling us, as of nearly 10 months ago, nothing was in the works. Well, in the wake of EA laying off staff, an interesting opportunity I think arises for a potential sequel to this franchise. EA in its statement to employees and press stressed the importance and intent to focus future titles on owned IP and less reliance on licensing. Now, we know that licensing adds extra costs to game development, especially for the IP EA is involved in like Star Wars, which would certainly have applied to the cancelled FPS project incubating at Respawn. These licensing fees are no joke. For a franchise like Star Wars, the licensing fee is likely 9 figures at minimum, on top of the already lucrative development costs of AAA games. This adds even more pressure to AAA games, as they have to add in 9-figure sums to development budgets that are already ballooned into the hundreds of millions of dollars. EA, following last week's comments, are really only interested in their core franchises and their core owned IP for further future projects, outside of the already committed licensing deals they have for games like Black Panther and Iron Man. And despite laying off staff at some Battlefield-adjacent studios, the main takeaway from last week that affected Respawn was that the currently incubating Star Wars FPS was cancelled entirely, leaving a team with no project to work on, and a gaping hole in what would be their normal development pipeline of multiple projects being incubated at the same time. So in committing to working on their own IP, and a team without a game who had previously been working on an FPS set in a futuristic world, what's to say that that team doesn't go and work on Titanfall 3? The team clearly has an expertise working on an FPS, and Respawn obviously has a team currently working on the successful gameplay systems and design of Apex Legends, which is Titanfall adjacent. EA owns the IP entirely, so the focus of moving away from licensing would make the title a prime candidate for development at Respawn. And based on comments from Vince last year, we know that there is desire from him and likely many others at the studio to continue to develop in that world. Titanfall 2 didn't fail because it was a bad game. Titanfall was simply dealt a bad hand with regards to the release window. Given this team's availability and EA's future goals, it seems to me that there's an obvious direction for Respawn's third team in further developing this franchise. It seems likely EA wouldn't want to pull people away from Apex Legends, which already has much more than just the typical Battle Royale modes, and even modes that you might expect to see in what would have been a multiplayer Titanfall game. But who's to say that the new entry has to even have multiplayer at all? In fact, I would argue it might make even more sense for EA to develop a single-player Titanfall game that could simply serve as what would be an extension of the Apex and Titanfall universe, and pull players who traditionally would like Titanfall games into Apex, and people who traditionally play Apex into the Titanfall universe. The potential to cross-pollinate between the two titles, offering cosmetics for Apex in the new entry, or even further iterating Apex into having a much more traditional multiplayer focus, in the same way that Warzone and Call of Duty have both traditional multiplayer and a Battle Royale for the same universe. In fact, EA could even treat this as a relaunching of Apex and Titanfall together, as more of a shared world with more shared experiences and a larger footprint than the sum of their parts. We've seen in the last few years, large FPS games in AAA do sell well and do have a market. Since the release in 2016, Games like Doom Eternal, Metro Exodus, Borderlands 3, Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, Far Cry, and much more have released a critical and commercial success across platforms. And while some of those games do feature co-op and aren't strictly single-player games, their root is still a narrative-based single-player FPS gameplay. There is a market for a game like this, if EA gives it the right budget and release date, and the upside with their continued focus on Apex also exists. Before last week's layoffs, a game like this for myself and others would have been a pipe dream. We know EA wants big hits. They want games that sell 10+ million copies. And Titanfall 2 wasn't exactly that, even if I ultimately believe that the fault with this lies in EA's publishing decisions regarding the game's release. Still, it's arguable the franchise is more popular than ever with the success of Apex Legends. We know that devs and leadership at Respawn would probably love to make this game, and a team with no project now simply has the availability to focus on what EA's future goals are, projects in which they have complete creative control. With the synergy between EA's current goals, based on their statements last week, and a potential Titanfall 3 sequel, makes the game a real possibility in my eyes. EA is focused on its core franchises and games that it controls completely. A game like Titanfall 3 would simply feed back into its core Apex multiplayer suite, could be additive to that while still capturing an audience that is underserved in the single-player FPS genre. I think a game like this has a real chance at being successful if EA just simply plans its release and its budget accordingly and gives it the proper care it deserves. That's going to do it for me, guys. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.